So we're glad to welcome Jeremy Kalin as tonight's featured speaker. Jeremy is an attorney with Advisen Legal, which is a boutique business law firm. And he works to mobilize capital for client and public good. And kind of within that, he particularly specializes in expanding access to solar and other renewable energy and financing. He served as chair of CLEAN, that acronym is the Coalition of Legislators for Energy Action Now, President Obama's Climate and Clean Energy Task Force. And when he was a representative to the Minnesota House, he helped write foundational legislation for the solar industry in our state. Jeremy's been instrumental in making MNIPL's small business solar equity program possible through the partnership with Lake Street Solar. And he's been a really good and caring friend to MNIPL all through the years. So we're really happy to have you on, Jeremy. Thanks a lot. And I'd like to start out, I know you've got an interesting story in a lot of different ways that fits you particularly well for renewable energy. I know your family tradition of Judaism is important to your way of being in the world and your life and anchors you in the justice side of this. And I wonder if you just begin by talking some about your story and kind of the why of your involvement.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Can you see the my PowerPoint now?
Yes.
So the reason why I was, as I shared with Buff, we'll keep this really informal. I was sort of swallowing, hoovering down my matzo ball soup to be almost a caricature of myself, because my Judaism is really important to me. It happened to be what was easy to grab, because I finished throwing together a few visuals to support the conversation at about 6:50. So appreciate that. But tikkun olam is a concept in my faith in Judaism. It's the repair of the world. It's been a thread throughout my life that I got from my upbringing, from my grandparents and my parents. My story of kind of how does a guy with a Bachelor of Fine Arts who used to make teapots like this and built, so these are some of my work that was fired in the wood-fired and salt-glazed kiln up in just north of Taylor's Falls. There we go. And now some work I'm actually starting to make pots again, kind of as my jam, not my job, but my jam, down in my basement studio here in Minneapolis. The idea of kind of making a difference, making the world a more beautiful place and a more special place has always been something that I got, from the community that modeled for me, both in Sioux City, Iowa, where my grandparents were second generation retailers, and my dad was third. And then when I moved up to Chisago County outside of Taylor's Falls and was one of the village potters, and made the dear friendships with a good dozen people who are on this call, and just it warms my heart as much as the soup does to see all of you here. One of the things that really stuck with me, actually, talking about my roots, was my dad took over. Ironically, he was a deep introvert, that was stuck managing a retail business in the heart of Sioux City, Iowa, with a tight business community for a decade. And, I think it exhausted all of his extroversion for the rest of his life. But, I saw the handshake, the trust, the close connection of a small economy, and how it really worked when you knew your customers and you made decisions about where you bought your goods and your services. And then the farm crisis really resulted from, among other things, consolidation of banks and kind of catching farmers out, trying to chase survival. And we lost our store because we got caught in a swing loan at a time when banks were no longer making their own decision, but were being controlled by Des Moines and then ultimately Chicago and New York. And that had a really marked impact on my life, about the importance of making economic decisions that really matter, that being in community, both in terms of making the world a more beautiful place, but also kind of trying to make a difference for each other, and the goal of virtuous economies. So this is me, the very first bill I got. I moved out to Minneapolis, moved out to the sticks, had a great life, but I'm a social introvert. And so the social side of me was not so happy 12 hours a day in the studio. Went to architecture school, left the Midwest on purpose. 9/11 happened the first month, and then Paul Wellstone was killed the next year. And so I got this call to think about an even bigger scale than just the spaces that we share food and the objects we share food, but increasingly the economies in which we live, and really have spent my life now designing better systems and helping design better economic systems and better policies, not just individual buildings or individual pots. And so this was the first major bill I got to chief author in 2007 after getting elected, thanks to the hard work of some people on this call. And 12,177 doors myself knocked, and 400 volunteers, and 5 pairs of shoes, and it's for another story. But so, this was the energy efficiency, energy conservation standard that became the strongest of its kind in the country, and has helped us meet and exceed our next generation energy targets, largely on the carbon side. And I just love this because this was a 1,000-watt bulb that my colleague and friend Sheldon Strom was illustrating, that we still at the time had gyms in greater Minnesota that were using wasteful 1,000-watt bulbs, like 80 of them, and now getting replaced by 16-watt floods, that LEDs. That is pretty amazing. It's also just a great picture. So I found myself somehow standing here at the White House in 2009, and which led to this whole journey of working for President Obama, being the state legislative liaison for the White House climate team, and just getting to do crazy things like write talking points to the president and welcoming him here at Air Force One, or when Air Force One came to town. And being able to work at that scale and take lessons we learned, like the 35W bridge collapse here, and apply it to the BP escrow, to the oil spill, that was meaningful. But I realized that what I really wanted to do is work at the scale of capital. And so I've spent the last 12 years trying to mobilize capital for underserved communities in this space, like I was able to do for the city of Baltimore, and actually just got re-engaged to make solar available to nonprofits, to churches, to community-owned facilities. And it really it's been a joy to take all that design and artistry experience and apply it to kind of the creative art of how do you lawyer this stuff, how do you structure the financing, and how do we turn what we know is good stuff, is the right thing to do, and is increasingly cost competitive. How do we turn it into jobs for some of the people you see here? How do you turn it into beneficiary for I think this is Miss Betty, if I remember right, who owns her own home in Baltimore, and these panels are about to go up on her house on East 21st Street, one of the toughest neighborhoods on all the Mid-Atlantic coast. And so this is really fun projects I get to work on, and of course working on with folks like you. And I screwed up on this slide, so I'm gonna do one thing here and show you the guy who helped make all this possible, which is my dad, who died this summer. And so here he was my Superman, and really showed me how you can do this with great meaning, and how you can translate this all into a life of deep meaning. And one of the very, very last conversations, as Buff knows, that we had as I helped walk him out of the world, was what to do with his body. And we had a conversation about burying or cremation. And in Judaism, you typically bury, but because of what he called a Frodkin burial, so a very simple, in the shroud, in your prayer tallis, in a pine box with no metal. And yet now, by code, it's a great example of how policy ends up kind of interrupting and challenging us. Almost every Jewish burial has a concrete cap, very concrete or very carbon intensive, and my dad's last thoughts were, I just want to do what's most gentle on the earth. So he donated his body to science and was cremated, and we now have his ashes. And this spring we will plant fruit trees here at our house, and he will help to continue to put down roots and help us bear the fruit. And I feel like my life is a good testament to my dad's work and to the work that we get to do together. So that's my
Wow,
story, and I'm sticking to it, Buff.
that's a great story. That's really good. Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about you were in the policy side, and you clearly have come over to the finance side. And some of the folks on this call I can see, are familiar with some of that finance, but some folks might not be. Can you kind of summarize what the finance side of solar and energy efficiency are here, and kind of some of the ins and outs of that and solutions that are possible?
Yeah, you bet. Forgive me if this is at too much of a 101 level, but I've worked really hard to try to think about taking what can be extremely complex and make it digestible for myself first. And I know if I can get my head wrapped around it, that others can too, because I have a very fast working brain, but I like to think about 12 things at once. So if it's not simple enough, I'm going to lose track of it. And before I kind of dive into that, I think it's helpful to know that at my former consultancy, Eutectics, where we basically did everything but practice law, we helped put together $293 million of solar and energy efficiency projects around the country, almost all of which were smaller than $1 million. So, I think my hairline has receded a little bit, partly from banging my head against the wall, from learning, trying to do the impossible things, but always trying. I have a saying, I don't like doing pretty cul-de-sacs. So I don't like doing story or projects that you just do a ribbon cutting and you can't replicate them. It's been one of the, I think, guiding principles to our work together on the Lake Street solar portfolio, Buff. So I like to think of it as actually really, really simple formula for solar. So how much is it going to cost? Right? We got to pay for engineering, procurement, and construction, what's called EPC often. And some soft costs, like often you have us lawyers or accountants involved, and sales and other pieces. But basically, how much does it cost? And usually described as a cost per watt. And then how do you recoup that cost? Well, from the value of the electricity you produce, from the incentives, state, local, and utility, and then tax credits and other kind of tax benefits. And that's really kind of the formula. So you're going to generate a lot of power, and if so, what's that power worth? And then what are the other ways that you can get reimbursed for delivering solar as an added resource to the grid? And how can you leverage those tax benefits? So I'm going to talk quickly about this project, which I know intimately well because that happens to be our garage and our project that we did at the end of 2018. And so it's 16 panels, 5.76 kilowatts. And so forgive me for a little bit of math here, but it costs $19,270, $3.35 a watt. Now it's a pretty efficient design on this flat roof, but it's, or the simple gable roof, but it's probably be about 20-30 cents a watt cheaper now. Excuse me one second. So it produced last year in 2021, I actually looked up about an hour ago, 6,120 kilowatt hours. And the value of that electricity, because of something called net metering. So it doesn't matter when in Minnesota, when you generate your power, provided you comply with the small little lane that you got, or small little few parameters. If in May, we're producing a lot of power and it's a 70-degree day and it's sunny, but we don't need to use the air conditioning and I'm not firing the electric kiln and we're not using much power, we'll be feeding back to the grid. And actually, I used to say, like, we're just giving to the grid and it goes everywhere. But actually, by the way electrons work, it actually literally goes to our neighbors, right? Because they use the very electrons that are available. And so that's just shy of $800 a year that we saved from Xcel Energy, and some months we get bill credits because we overproduced that month. And then because of when we were in the solar rewards program, we get an additional 8 cents for every kilowatt hour we produce for 10 years. And so that's about $490. And we were able to take the 30% tax credit on our own taxes, our federal taxes, that saved us, $5,700. So all in, it cost us $13,489. And I missed a dollar sign, but you get it's $1,285 for lines 1 and 2 a year. And I did the simple math, 10 and a half years. Actually, the value, because Xcel's rates keep going up, the 10 and a half year payback period is actually about 9.8 years, but just for this purpose, I kept it really simple. And we actually ended up financing it with a home equity loan. Basically, it's the easiest way to think about how we did it. And so we didn't pay anything out of pocket because we got the loan. And our loan payments are about $1,300 a year. Our solar benefit is just shy of $1,300 a year. So it's paying for itself. And in fact, it's actually probably we're probably saving $50 to $100 a year net now. And our 2022 production will actually be about 200, 300 kilowatt hours higher than 2021 just because of weather. So it's looking good. So I know that IPL's been working has a residential solar partner, right? Buff, if you want to just.
Yeah, exactly. I'll drop, I know we're going to talk mainly about congregational, so I'm glad you started with homeowners. I'll be dropping in the chat our links to our residential partner, Solar United Neighbors, and they got a great program for helping homeowners get a really good deal on solar and navigate the complexities of it. So, but it's fun to see your home up there with the actual numbers. So thanks a lot, Jeremy. That's great.
Yeah, you bet. And I think I'll just say about Solar United Neighbors, one of the great benefits of working with them is you get the kind of technical assistance and handholding to answer questions through, because everybody's particular scenario is different. And you get the advantage of the bulk buy, right? Of multiple projects being equipment purchased and mobilized at once. So that $335 a watt is probably, I got the Solar Pioneer discount from the installer and probably still would have liked to see it cheaper than that. And then, and I think you benefit from the they put out RFPs and choose for each bulk buy, each cooperative effort. So you have a qualified installer and don't necessarily need to go through that work yourself, although you can. But I want to focus on the congregational side and nonprofits, and particularly that's where the Inflation Reduction Act has been a game changer in lots of ways. So you might know this woman in the middle, Julia Nurbin, Executive Director of MNIPL. Here we are at Liberty Church in North Minneapolis, 21st and Emerson, Pastor Aquila, awesome dynamic woman who's just like, you're the prophet, you're the godsend. We can't believe we get to participate in this creation care. And thanks to my friend and client, Umber Nakvi, who was very lucky to make a good living and be able to cash out on 20 years of building a non-solar software platform. And after putting solar on his own roof and seeing how community solar entrepreneurs were struggling to use software to make things work for him, said, hey, I want to do that. I know how to do this. It's pretty straightforward. I want to make a difference. And we discovered that he was a bit of a unicorn in that he had a tax appetite. He had a tax bill that we could offset. And rather than invest in a big, huge project in another state where he could make a little bit of money, actually probably more money than we're doing through Lake Street Solar, when Julia and I pitched the proposition that he could invest in solar, hire Black-owned contractors to do the installation, and invest in projects along Lake Street, near George Floyd Square, and in North Minneapolis. He just was like, what? Let's go. So Buff has been the awesome outreach partner. kind of a sales guy, but if you know Buff, you know that he actually doesn't know how to sell anything. He just knows how to tell you stuff and be honest about it. And so we did 6 projects in 2021 and are scaling up about 3 times the total wattage in 2022 and are in the process of securing a major investment partner for 2023 that gets, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act and what we have proven, that we can actually make solar available to congregations and nonprofits and multifamily housing. It's really rewarding. But I want to just talk about, if this was here's the hard-nosed numbers. If we were able to just in a hypothetical, if Liberty Church was a business, so we'll start there. It was $60,000 for a 25 kilowatt system. So about $250 a watt. And you can see that you start getting scale, plus a few years later, the price went down. It produces about 27,000 kilowatt hours a year, and they pay the value of the solar delivered to the grid for Liberty Church offsets their bill 14 cents for every kilowatt hour. So it's $3,800 a year. That's the value just of the solar production with no incentives. So if you had no other incentives, you would just take 60,000 divided by 3,800 and take about 15 years to pay it off. Whoop. We were lucky enough to get, we actually did not get the solar rewards incentive for this project, excuse me. So my numbers are wrong here, but if we had gotten solar rewards, Excel would be writing us a check, writing the church a check for 6 cents for every of those kilowatt hours gets produced. So $1,600. So it's about $5,500. So without any other support, it'd be an 11-year payback. City of Minneapolis happens to have this green cost share grant. So that covered some of the upfront cost. And at the time, the federal tax credit was 26% and declining each year. So if they were a business, they could have benefited from that $15,000 tax credit and could have depreciated the federal and state depreciation left over and would have been left with a $14,868 upfront cost. Well, after depreciation, but we'll assume that you could pocket that right away, and $5,400 worth of solar generation, which means in an ideal world, the tabula rasa that we would talk about in architecture that doesn't actually exist. It's a 3-year payback. So I see all the time that solar salespeople talk about it this way. You shouldn't. And I'm going to skip this next slide because what I really want to talk about here is the reality that actually this, oh man, I did delete a slide. Please forgive me. We're missing a slide here because what I really want you to know is this slide, except it's not quite complete. But what we were able to do is, assume that's 26%, not 30, is Umber was able to own the solar system and lease the roof and be responsible for all that upfront cost and sell the power back to the congregation at a 5 to 20% discount, depending on solar rewards. Without solar rewards, we were at, I think, 5% buff, right? Maybe 10, 5% savings. But you're able to meet your care creation commitment and save money every year. Umber's responsible, Lake Street Solar is responsible to own and operate that system and to sell the power back to you at less than the 14 cents that you pay Excel. And then after 7 years, you can buy the system or get it for either $1 or 5% of the original cost. And you then get all of the energy savings. And if you got solar rewards, you'd still get that too. So pretty sweet deal. They were able to not say that you have to go through this rigmarole and pay for $33,000 or $59,000 or take away just a little bit there, right? You don't have to pay anything up front. But the reason why I talked about Umber as a little bit of a unicorn is 2 things. Until the Inflation Reduction Act, this federal tax credit has been non-transferable and non-refundable. So how many, if you could just in the chat, just say, we pay taxes if you're a church that pays taxes and has a tax bill. Right? Nobody. So, and before the Inflation Reduction Act, this federal tax credit was not available to you. And because depreciation deduction requires that you have a tax bill and that you be able to reduce your tax bill by expensing and spreading out over 5 years in the case of solar, this $20,000 is also not available to you. So you're stuck with a $59,000 cost and maybe an $8,000 or $9,000 grant if you're lucky enough to live in Minneapolis or St. Paul or a community that has that kind of grant. Generally, most utilities and cities don't. So if you're a congregation before the Inflation Reduction Act and you want to make this work and you don't have a tax equity partner that can monetize the tax credit and depreciation benefit, you're out of luck, right? You're stuck paying $59,000 with a loan or passing the plate. And in Judaism, we don't pass the plate. So, you got to fold the tab at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and, make your commitment there. And we all know that nearly every congregation has 75,000 needs that you need to meet before you put solar on your roof. Like, address your roof, right, Buff? Like, take care of the dang roof before we can put solar on it. So the Inflation Reduction Act has been a dramatic change, and for lots of reasons. The most important reason for the purpose of churches, well, there are two or three. First, I'm going to talk about solar, and I think, Buff, you may have a question teed up for other technologies, but I'm just going to focus on solar first, although it applies to all other technologies that have been brought under the energy tax credit umbrella. The tax credit was set this year to end at the end of 2022 or 3, I can't remember which, at 22%, and then be down to 10% like all other related investment. So if you're a project that's 1,000 kilowatts or 1 megawatt, so roughly 3,000 panels, 2,500 panels, somewhere in that neighborhood. So very, very, very big project. Like, think the airport canopy on top of the parking ramp. You are at 30% for the next 10 years. So nearly permanent is how I describe it. So the residential credit is the same, and the investment tax credit is the same. I'm only talking about the investment tax credit, which is any commercial operation, which includes nonprofits. There are two big changes. Remember how I said that it's non-transferable and non-refundable? Well, thanks to Senator Tina Smith, the tax credit is now transferable, but only once, because we can't create the new mortgage crisis and sell it and sell it and sell it. So you can sell it once, and it's refundable. Meaning, if you're a church and you install a project in 2023 that's $100,000 cost, you can file early in 2024. You can file the same form. In fact, I get going to Washington, D.C. for the Renewable Energy Tax Credit Conference with a bunch of accountants and tax lawyers. We're going to be I tell you, such a fun party. But we're digging into the details on advising Treasury and the IRS on what that refundability process will look like among 70,000 other implementation questions. But that 30% you should get back as a refund on your taxes the next year. So when you file if you're a nonprofit and you have to file a 990, you filed the 990. If you're a church and you're exempt, we think you just file the tax credit form and another form that'll be 1 or 2 pages that the IRS brings, and you get that 30% back. If you there's a bunch of additional ways to boost that credit, which is just amazing. If you and there's an error here, that this energy community adder is 20%, not 10, but if you use US made steel or US made solar equipment, and Buff, just today, I think we identified that aluminum and the racking is very likely to count for that domestic content adder. We have some work to get Treasury. We're going to be advocating very hard, and we think it's squarely within the intent of the law. So now you're not at that $100,000 project, $30,000 refund. Now you're at a $40,000 refund. If you happen to be in a community that used to have a coal mine, I don't think that's any in Minnesota. If you happen to be near Becker and you had a coal plant that is closed, a coal-fired power plant, you might be able to add either 10 or 20%, depending on circumstances. And then those projects that we've been doing in distressed census tracts, and I'll look at that for you in a sec, you could add 10% there, or if you're directly benefiting low and moderate income people through like a community solar project, you can actually add not 10%, but 20%. So you actually could get to a, man, there's some outdated info in here. I gotta clean up this slide. But you could get to like 40%, 50%, 60%, 80% of a project covered with the tax credit. And now it's refundable, or you don't need to find the Umber Knockvies of the world or sell to the Warren Buffetts of the world, but you can sell to people in your congregation that have a tax appetite, meaning a federal tax bill. And then there's one more little geeky thing, and I won't get too geeky on this, I promise. But a project finished this year, and for the last 17 years of the tax credit, has been able to look back one previous year and reduce your taxes for the previous year. Now, any project in 2023 or beyond can actually look back as many as 3 years. So if you have a $100,000 project on your church roof, generates a $30,000 tax credit, and you have a congregant who's had a $10,000 federal bill in 20, 21, and 22, they could actually buy that tax credit and offset all of their taxes and file us with their accountant a simple amended return for 20, 21, and 22 the day after you flip the switch on that solar project in 2023, and they will get a check for $30,000 within, however long the IRS acts. But let's say, 10 to 12 weeks. And so it's going to be an interesting opportunity for us to really leverage this. We have tried for years. I know some of the people on this webinar, we've been talking about how to take advantage of it somehow with those unicorns that might be congregants that could take advantage of it previously. Now I think that it's going to be a no-brainer. It's going to be a lot of fun to structure these projects. So what does that project that used to be a 9.5 or 10-year payback look like? Now, at the same cost, and so we're not inflating the cost to use American-made equipment. So I'm just doing the 30% credit here. We have the same incentives, let's just say on paper. And now we have brought in an $18,000 tax credit that we couldn't touch before. We still can't do depreciation deduction because we don't have any ongoing tax bill to offset, but that upfront cost is now $33,000, and we're still making that same $5,500 worth of solar. So now you have a 6-year simple payback. You do have to finance this $18,000 for 12 months or figure out how you're going to pay your contractor and then get the money back. But that's a manageable problem, and I expect we'll see some loan funds. We might see some simple congregation loans, congregant to congregation loans to cover that. But a game changer. Still a 6-year payback though. So we think we will still see the Lake Street solar partnerships make sense and just be able to increase the savings to anywhere from 10 to 40%, because it'll still be zero down. We'll lease the roof, own the system, pay for it, and sell you the power at a discount. And after the 7 years are up, which is part of the tax code, congregations will be able to then just own the system. So I just want to go one more quick step here, Buff, just to carry this all the way through. I know this is a lot, but the notion of this credit being transferable and it being potentially refundable is truly an amazing game changer. We do realize that this $20,000 of value of depreciation gets stranded. And so that's where I think the solar, we'll still see a lot of circumstances where this kind of solar lease, the Lake Street solar model, will make sense. And that's where we're talking about, millions of dollars of partnership with community-based investors that get this and will want to make more of this happen, which I'm excited about. And lastly, I talked about a little bit of this 10% environmental justice community, or the new market tax credit community. So it's just the distressed census tracts. across Minnesota. And so if you're in red or yellow, and I deliberately kept this up for our greater Minnesota friends too, these are designated as economically distressed communities. And it's just the U.S. Department of Commerce, EDA puts this out all the time. And here you can see in the metro area, when you really zoom in on the map, you'll see that many of the communities where we have been doing work, Buff, will automatically be eligible for that 10% adder. So I'll pause there. Kind of dumped a lot on you there, but I'm really, really, really excited about the fact that all of this for these small 1 megawatt projects are at this scale that makes sense. If you're doing a big project, you have to hire prevailing wage and bring apprentices and everything else. And Tina Smith was really successful in saying, if you're doing community scale work, you should get additional benefit through the tax code. And it's pretty powerful seeing how it works on the ground.
Jeremy, that is fantastic explanation. That is a lot of information. And just to trim up a few simple sides to that, can you just verify we're talking about this being in place for 10 years? Is it the IRA? Is it?
So this is really interesting, actually, Buff, that I think we're going to see some transformation in the energy world. In fact, there was an article, I can't remember if it was Bloomberg or New York Times, that said that I should know, I reposted it on LinkedIn, but said that the low carbon economy is about to get booming. It's not future, it's present. I mean, the solar world, there were 27,000 people at the solar conference in Anaheim a month and a half ago, the largest energy conference in North America. I mean, like there were 50 people at conferences when I would go, 150 when I would go to national conferences in 2008 and 9. It is booming now. And the Inflation Reduction Act has done things like, projects like this that bring solar and batteries, that energy storage is now within that ITC world. Sage electrochromic windows down in Faribault that tints their glass based on the light coming in, so you need less heating and cooling, less cooling especially. That's now an eligible technology. Hydrogen, biogas, like, so that those technologies have been named. And then in 2025, we start the transition to a technology neutral low carbon tax credit, which becomes permanent. So the ITC stays for 10 years, and I believe that low carbon tax credit becomes permanent and is at the same dollar amount, and solar will obviously qualify for it. So, but in the way I talk about it, it's now permanent. It's not just 10 years, it is for good. And we're seeing projects that are ready to go in 2022 actually wait to get their switch flipped so they can take advantage of the changes in the Inflation Reduction Act for 2023.
Okay, that's very helpful. That's a little more detailed than I realized is there. So I'm glad I asked that question. And then the other thing, just to kind of make sure, kind of elementary, but I and others have heard some of this about getting the pay for, that the tax credit is available now and it's transferable. And so to your knowledge, is this paperwork just through the IRS? So even though you're not a tax paying entity, you still file paperwork through the IRS, and the federal government really does send you a check? I mean, is that really that easy?
I mean, the answer is, in fact, I teed this up, so I'm gonna actually reshare, or I'm gonna pull up this is what I'm spending like 3 hours of my day doing, is reading these 6 notices from the IRS. Public comments are due on Friday. And so it's by no accident that a bunch of us tax lawyers and tax accountants and renewable energy people are descending on Washington, D.C. tomorrow, Thursday and Friday, because we're going through all of these comments or these notices and making sure that we're giving comments to make it as absolutely easy as possible. The answer, Buff, is we don't yet know how they're going to be implemented. And so it's going to take some time to keep working through those pieces. But in general, the IRS is supposed to give us guidance by the end of the year in some of these cases, by mid-February in other cases. And so I'm happy to take any comments and feedback and work with folks. There's my contact info. Because for instance, we think that what the simplest thing is going to be if you're going to sell the credit and not have to wait for the refund, that you might sell it for 90 cents on the dollar, meaning that $30,000 credit you might sell for $27,000. Well, you need a contract, right? You need a decent contract. If you're going to have a congregant lend the congregation money for that $30,000 at 2% interest or 0% interest or however you want to do it, then you probably need a decent note. That doesn't need to be too complicated, but I think that just sort of working out those details is starting to matter. And everything that I thought was like totally obvious in the language of the law, even those of us who are like, it says clearly in the law, this is how it's going to work. Well, we should probably tell the IRS that they should just follow the law and then give 6 examples to them where they should not say that you could do anything different. Right? We just want to keep things simple and straightforward. And largely, I think it's an A to an A+ of drafting. It's a beautifully written law that I think should be pretty simple for churches to comply with in the end.
Excellent. Okay, we do have some questions that have come through the chat I want to bring to you here in just a minute. But before we go to Q&A, one thing that we haven't touched on yet, I just want to see what you're thinking about is I've heard that the IRA supports maybe a national kind of green bank fund that can offer maybe some lower interest rates for either nonprofits or low income or those. Is that a reality? Is that an option? And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I've been actually an advocate of Minnesota Green Bank for 15 years, I think. 14 years. The end of 2008, started putting on the table something that looked and acted a lot like a green bank, because this access to upfront capital is really critical to paying for implementation. So we're very lucky that everything from the St. Paul Port Authority to the Center for Energy and Economy, CEE, to others, that we just have a robust to the private sector, to the CU Green and the credit unions, from Spire to Affinity Plus to Highway, to Bremer Bank and others. We have a plethora of really well-educated lenders and financiers. But the reality is that we need to continue to extend the opportunity for that cash. So for that financing. So yes, it's going to take a little bit to figure out exactly how that green bank money is going to flow to states and which entities are going to oversee it. I know the McKnight Foundation just started convening a conversation formally on that process. And fortunately, one of my clients, the DC Green Bank, their CEO just left to be executive director of the national consortium trying to push hard and get the money out the door and get it out on the street for those asset classes and markets that need it. And nonprofits and multifamily and churches being one of the ones I'll be talking to Eli about for sure.
Oh, that's great. That's very helpful.
I know that there's some conversations, Buff, I can see just in the chat a little bit about new technologies and other pieces. And I think that one of the challenges, of course, is to make funding available for those maybe not perfectly proven technologies, but the ones that we know are coming right behind solar, PV, and batteries, and the next. So hydrogen and heat pumps, and we're actually doing a boatload of biogas and renewable energy projects and sort of closed loop, really cool stuff that I think we'll take advantage of that technology risk reduction for new technologies that the green banks will also take care of.
Yeah, and on that topic, I'm glad you saw that in the chat and brought that up. I wanted to address energy efficiency, and I know Brett I think you're on the call, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about Rewiring America and kind of what you've learned about energy efficiency there.
Yeah, I'll post it in the chat, but Jeremy's, by the way, that was just fantastic. There, you can't pay for this kind of advice that we're getting from Jeremy. So thank you, Jeremy. My notes are extensive right now, so I have questions. But yeah, if we want to talk about energy efficiency, we're going to move from the commercial space where Jeremy's been talking about nonprofits in the commercial world, and you know, a lot of the energy there is some energy. There are some energy efficiency items that also might apply. In fact, the same credit that Jeremy was talking about with solar, you probably wouldn't, most people wouldn't call this efficiency, but a lot of you would consider it efficiency is if you have a geothermal or ground source heat pump, you know, powering your church. We just had a church right across the border in Minong and up here in north part of the world. And yeah, even before the ITC that came out, all these the same benefits would apply to a church that wanted to go geothermal for its heating system. So it's a game changer. But even up here, they were starting, those things are penciling out even before any of this. So we really hope to see that expand a lot too for churches. But on the individual side, there's a ton on homeowners in terms of electrifying your homes. And electrification is the new buzzword for efficiency, I would say, at this point. And you'll hear heat pump all the time now, and that's just a very efficient way to heat your home, whether that's geothermally or through an air source heat pump. So I'll post a little calculator from Rewiring America in the chat, and that is something where you individually can put in your information, and it shows you the full litany and menu of all the credits that might be available to you, credits, rebates, tax credits, all that kind of stuff. So it's an exciting time. I don't think we have time to get into all of that here, but I'll let people play with that calculator as we go back to the commercial space, perhaps. You know.
Great, thanks, Brett. And just so everybody knows, you know, you don't have to capture every single thing that's been in the chat or the notes. There's going to be two major ways that you can get this information. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email. And also right now in the chat, I'm going to drop a link in for a interest form. And if you want to, it's a simple, easy to fill out 5-question interest form. And you can just indicate what you're interested in, and it'll connect you to me, and I'll get you the answers to the questions that you have if you haven't gotten those, or I'll get you connected to the programs that can help you and your congregation take advantage of these things that Jeremy has been talking about. Jeremy, I saw a question in the chat about some of these extra. You identified aluminum as a domestic source option that might be, and some folks have talked about other things like roof and roof repairs and other things with solar, or implement things that have to be implemented to allow you to implement the energy efficiency or something. Do you know, is it clear yet whether those things qualify for some of these credits as well, the tax credit and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the roof first. So this is like, you know, gosh, can I include the roof in my, because I need to re-roof. Without the solar, I would still need to re-roof. So it's not like the roof is essential to the solar project. And, you know, over and over and over, the IRS has said pretty clearly that the general roof repairs and re-roofing is not something you can put inside the basis, and you know, that 100,000 becomes 130,000, for instance, for the tax credit. But if you're increasing the energy performance of your roof and adding insulation and doing a cool reflective roof and other pieces, those components can be included and actually are explicitly, I believe, explicitly included on top of that. Please ignore my son's request for something on his iPad. And then in terms of, you know, like boiler repair and heat pumps and other pieces, I think we have to look at a little bit more of the detail of the law. In general, heat pumps and kind of electrification broadly is deeply supported. It's an area of the law that, frankly, after Friday's comment period is closed on these first 6 notices, I can spend a little bit more time digging in. And so maybe we want to revisit that later, or I can add it to the list of articles that we'll be writing on the law firm's website, and we can point them to folks as a follow-up once we get it written out. But in general, I think there's just a boatload of, use that phrase again, a plethora of qualifying tax credits that can help. I've never really been a fan of tax credits because they have not been refundable, but here it's really like an open grant that Congress has given us to support good things.
Yeah, it really is a game changer in a lot of ways. Could you talk just a little bit more about, you mentioned that in a couple of situations, transferable or, helping congregants, members of a congregation, or even maybe a donor to a nonprofit or on a board member of a nonprofit, helping with this financing. If you were, let's say you were doing this in your faith community at Shir Tikva, how might you approach the congregation or, people within your community to talk about this? What do you think about that? I know that's not exactly in your expertise, but I know you work with a lot of people, and you work with your faith community. What might that look like?
So, I think before getting there, and this is the weird chicken and egg question, if we want to get to a theological question, right? You want to have a firm enough understanding of what the numbers might look like of a project, right? You need to give a sort of like I did of the $100,000 project or the $60,000 project at Liberty Church, because you need to know kind of what you're talking about and how the mechanics would work. But I think if you can really get a simple explanation and kind of general scope, so that may involve having a solar consultant or contractor come out and give you a little bid, or we can, Buff and I and others can work with you to get that scoped quickly. So let's say you have a good sense that like $100,000 project is probably what it's going to be. And maybe you need a $20,000 roof repair on top of it. And so we figure out how to cover that $20,000 roof repair. But if then we know that we're going to have a $30,000 tax credit that we might be able to sell to a congregant. I was going to say parishioner, but we're talking about my synagogue, so we don't we talk about congregant to some mensch in the congregation. We might actually just put it in the synagogue bulletin, or make an announcement at our Friday night services of we're exploring the solar program, and have an opportunity for congregants to reduce their tax bill and support this project. And the general cost availability of the tax credit could be $30,000. And I would actually build a quick little page on your website that might explain, 2 to 3 paragraphs of the opportunity. So, Trinity Lutheran Lindstrom.org/solar. And then just to outline that in some detail and just push people to it. And then you just have individual conversations with folks that would be willing to make that support, whether it is as a loan or to buy the tax credit. I find actually that it's pretty straightforward and easy to raise those questions. And especially if the prospect is really, really clear of, hey, so if you are interested in lending, being part of the project and lending to us rather than investing somewhere else and making 2% interest for 12 months or 15 months to support going solar, please call Buff or whoever, right? Please call the rabbi. Well, the rabbi wouldn't do it here, but I think that's just being really succinct about the opportunity and the excitement of, hey, we have this chance thanks to the changed economics and the changed tax credit. I don't know if you have any more to say about that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I really appreciate that. We have a couple more questions, and I'll ask you. But just to let folks know, MNIPL has a couple of solar programs Jeremy referenced the Lake Street Solar Program, which is growing and going to have more access to that. We also have a program that's not quite as targeted, but it's with Apadana Solar, and we can work with you and your congregation. So the reason I bring that up is just to let you know that we do have multiple ways, and we can help you and your congregation find a way through to a PPA or an outright purchase that's going to work for you. We've got a good, interesting question here I hadn't really thought about, from Peter, just asking, if things change and the House or Senate becomes controlled by people that don't have the same feeling about climate that the folks that passed the IRA, is there any threat to this law being undone or restructured or anything?
Well, President Biden, this is going to be a signature achievement of the Biden administration. He will veto anything that scales back the heart of this law. There might be tweaks here or there, but I see zero risk of the heart of the Inflation Reduction Act being repealed or changed in the next 2.5, 3 years. I won by as Paul and Cass and the Adaires and other people up, and Joe and Susie Johnson and my friends up in Chisago know we won by 204 votes out of 20,000 in 2006. So we know how to count votes, and I'm very good at that. I think we're actually going to expand the climate support in the Senate. I think we may lose the House, or it's going to be very close, but I don't think we're going to be at risk of anything getting scaled back. And I did see another related question around the implementation. The bulk of the opportunity around the tax credit piece specifically, and again, not being a fan of tax credits without this refundability and transferability, I just have to rewrite my scripts in my head because I'm so used to panning them. But the heart of them requires zero implementation from states. The good news is that Minnesota, the state energy office, whether Republican or Democrat, has been progressive and helpful in doing the technical assistance and deploying other additional funds. And there's a lot of money out for state energy programs that I expect will be deployed pretty efficiently here in Minnesota, in addition to the heart of what we've talked about tonight. So the state level, there's not going to be many state barriers. The Green Bank stuff is going to take some time to work out. That's not going to happen overnight. But in general, January 1, 2023, let's rock and roll.
All right. Great. One of the questions that has come up on in the chat, and I know I've heard other discussion of this, and is about utility and larger grid issues. And I know Brett knows. I know Brett, you know some things about that, and Jeremy, you might know some things about that. Although that may be opaque to some extent. But do either of you want to comment on the questions about that? Just Excel's sluggishness in responding to some systems and turning things on, and the customer service there for developers and solar clients.
Go ahead, Jeremy. Go ahead.
I was going to let you chime in first, Brett. I've gotten to dominate a lot, but so that, yes, I mean, these grid congestion issues are real in a few key places. And Excel's challenge is that they really don't prioritize their capital investment, which is the primary way that they make money, on these small substations and transformer level, neighborhood level transformer upgrades. The good news is at a nonprofit and community solar level, that those interconnection charges, the upgrades to that interconnection infrastructure, is now actually explicitly included in the tax credit basis. So that $100,000 project, if you have a $50,000 transformer upgrade that Excel needs, that $50,000 can be added to the $100,000 and explicitly included in the tax credit. Now, it still means you'd have to deal with the remaining balance. But this is actually one of the questions that we're spending a lot of time on in those accounting work groups, of figuring out exactly what we want the IRS to tell us about how that gets allocated. But You know, the Excel generally is actually, while they've been a pain in the rear end in lots of different ways, the legislative and commission requirements, the state law requirements of what Excel needs to help us with is pretty significant. I'm really pleased that, for instance, Cass and Paul Dennison, if you give me a thumbs up, are you East Central Electric customers? Or nope, you're Excel. East Central Electric, for instance, has been a very tough co-op to work with. And now I'm hearing anecdotal reports of many people who've had successful solar experiences with them. And so like Minnesota Power, Otter Tail Power, other cooperatives, I just think that we're getting more and more support from utilities that makes me feel more optimistic in greater Minnesota.
East Central is just north of us, just north
Yeah.
of Schaefer. They come through north of Schaefer. And I know some people that put in solar a few years ago. And I had to really kind of handhold them to encourage them to work with East Central because they were not easy to deal with. But they
Yeah.
pulled it off in the end, but it was not an easy experience for them.
Well, Paul, I'm grateful that you've done that, because in the last 18 months, I've heard 3 or 4 interconnections with East Central that have gone much more smoothly. So kudos to you.
Yeah, and I'd like to offer, Brett Pence has been a leading force for holding Minnesota Power's feet to the fire, and knows a lot about, pressuring utilities. What you want to weigh in here, Brett?
Yeah, well, I want to steal Jeremy's slide on how costs and benefits of solar, because I thought that was great at the beginning. And one of the things that just happens in general in greater Minnesota, particularly outside of Excel service territory, is just in the past, the costs to do solar were higher and the benefits were lower. And so it was really hard to get projects to pencil out. And part of that was utilities were, solar was seen as much more of a threat within those, to those utilities. And so that was also a part of the issue. I am like Jeremy, I'm very optimistic. We've seen a lot of projects move very rapidly, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. And really with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's flipped those economics on their head. So literally projects that have been waiting I know a couple of projects in the area that have been waiting 2 or 3 years, they're on, they're just waiting for the switch to be flipped, as Jeremy's talking about, and ready to rock and roll. So I just anticipate a lot of projects starting to happen up here. And I guess the only other thing I'd say is, in terms of that congestion, just realize that congestion that you have in Excel territory is a result of, it is a problem of success. You have a lot of solar on your grid if you have that. So keep talking to your legislators about it, because I know I work in the PUC a lot, and I know talking to legislators, getting that information then to the PUC, because legislators are going to talk at the legislature. PUC listens to that. That's a great way to get those concerns out there, and that pressure eventually will get fixed in some way. So I'm very bullish on the future of solar in greater Minnesota as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Brett. I want to start winding us down towards the close here. And in doing that, I want to identify 2 things. First, just a last question that I saw in the chat about recycling and issues of end user of the materials in solar panels. I want to say MNSEA, which is the industry of solar developers in the state, is working hand in hand with the Public Utilities Commission right now to address that very issue. And they're asking the Public Utilities Commission to work with developers and with MNSEA, the industry association, to develop standards for recycling materials. So that's really good. And then I also want to shout out to Kyle from Minneapolis Climate Action and say thanks a lot for being on the call. I saw some things that you dropped into the chat and appreciate that. And folks, if Minneapolis Climate Action is fantastic. If you're from the Twin Cities, I encourage you to get involved. And it looks like you're sponsoring a solar gathering up on the north side soon. So folks, get involved in that if you can. And thanks for being on the call, Kyle, and your good questions. We have a last comment from our staff member, Joshua Lewis. But just before we go to Joshua, just anything to round out the evening with, Jeremy, that you want to say, and just let us say thank you so much for being on the call and giving us such fantastic information.
Well, I just, y'all are my people, right? You know, I get to do all sorts of things in my job these days as a impact investment lawyer, and this is as much fun as any part of it, truly. And I think on the recycling thing, rather than being substantive, I think or just substantive, I think that's a microcosm of what we're seeing in the work that I've been engaged in for 20 years, which is resource efficiency. In 15, 20, 25 years, at end of life, and actually we're seeing that 25 to 50 years will be the end of life for some of these modules. We will be at a point where it is more cost effective to figure out how to recycle and repurpose the metals and minerals that are embedded throughout the clean energy economy, and really, really excited by what's going to come next. And so if we think about kind of where mercury recycling is and where we were 20 years ago and the problem of mercury and complex fluorescence, for instance, I think we're going to start seeing that in precious metals up and down. And, you know, I think we'll still end up having to do some extraction and mining, but in general, I think we're going to see some reuse and repurposing at a scale we've never seen before, because these are problems that need to get solved. And that kind of virtuous economy is, I'm really, really, really excited about. And I hope we live to see it. I know my kids will live to see it, because they're going to have to, right? There's zero choice. We're just going to have to figure it out.
Yes, exactly. Well, thanks a ton, Jeremy. Really appreciate your gift to us tonight, and all the great information, and great to be in partnership with you. And thanks a lot for being on the call, Brett. Just to close us out, I want to go back to remind you that these things like the Inflation Reduction Act don't happen in a vacuum, and it does require support and work on our part at the systemic level. I hope my screen is showing. And I think Joshua had to drop off the call, but just in case you're not, if you're on the call, Joshua, give me a holler, but otherwise I'll just speak up for you and say, Joshua's done a great job of helping get out the vote and helping people have conversations about voting. And so he's got a handful of things that you can do between now and election night next week that you can get involved in and talk to your friends and your neighbors and folks and have conversations that help people get out and vote for climate values. So in the follow-up email, we will include that link to the work that he's doing and get you involved in that. Thanks a lot, everybody. Really appreciate you being on the call and giving time for the webinar. Watch for our follow-up email and all the information and ways that you can follow up with these issues. So thank you and have a good night.
Thanks, Buff. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.